Ichigo is notorious for having so much plot armor and the way he conveniently survives every encounter despite being overpowered by his opponents. Every time he's in the verge of dying, he gets up, somehow gets a transformation, and gives his opponents the ass whooping of their lives. Is what I would say if I wasn't paying attention. So today I want to discuss Ichigo's plot armor. Was it really plot armor, and if it was it really that bad? First and foremost, what is plot armor? Because, let's be honest, people have been throwing this term around so loosely that it has basically lost all meaning. Whenever someone doesn't like a fight's outcome, they immediately claim that a certain character only won because the author wanted them to, completely ignoring any narrative context behind why this character won or lost or whatever the hell happened. Take Gojo versus Sukuna as the prime example. We've been told on numerous occasions that Sukuna is the strongest cursed sorcerer in history, and in his full power, it is not ridiculous to believe that he can beat Gojo, even if Gojo himself stated otherwise. On top of that, the author verbatim stated before the fight even began that this is a battle between the strongest in history and the strongest as in now. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that the strongest of all time is stronger than the strongest of this generation. So essentially, JJ quite literally foreshadowed the fight's outcome. Yet we still have a big chunk of the JJK fandom complaining about Sukuna winning, even though it makes perfect sense, because they really like Gojo and they really like to do stuff with his action figure. But I digress. My point is, the viewer's emotional bias often outweighs any logical interpretation of the story, regardless of whether or not the show actually has plot armor. But even setting that aside, a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand what plot armor actually is. Plot armor isn't just the character won because the author wanted them to. Let's be real. Everything that happens in a story happens because the author wants it to. Whether the good guys win, lose, or get brutally listed
every day for summer.
It is all by design. Just because the main character wins in a seemingly convenient manner after being outscaled doesn't automatically mean it's plot armor. Because the author could have written the exact same fight with the main character starting off way stronger and winning effortlessly, rinse and repeat for every battle to dodge what people call plot armor. Or they could flip the script entirely and kill the protagonist in episode 1 for the sake of being realistic, between quotes. But the authors do not do that. And that's because the point of writing a story is to actually tell a story. And in a battle shown in manga, that usually means having the main character face challenges, grow from them, and live long enough to carry the narrative forward. Because we're not watching some edgy dark shit where every character gets soft for shock value, or some self-insert fantasy garbage like Soul Leveling where the protagonist simply mops the floor with everybody and gets all the girls. So technically, yes, in that sense, the plot does protect every main character. But that alone doesn't make it bad writing, and it's not the kind of plot armor that I'm talking about. It's real plot armor, the kind that deserves criticism when something happens in a way that completely breaks the internal logic of the story. No build-up, no explanation, and no consequences. It just happened solely because the author wanted it to happen, and there's nothing in the story itself to justify it. And don't get it twisted, I'm not saying Bleach is completely free of plot armor. In fact, I've made a whole video before discussing this topic, and I acknowledge that the series does have plot armor to a certain extent. But for the most part, that's not the case when it comes to Ichigo. Every time he survived a fight he shouldn't have, between quotes, or pulled out a new transformation, there was either an explanation, foreshadowing, or at the very least a narrative thread setting it up. And more importantly, every major transformation Ichigo went through wasn't thrown there by Kubo just to save his ass. It had thematic weight, it marked a turning point in his identity, his heritage, or his understanding of himself. He didn't get new forms just to survive, he got them because he was evolving as a character. As one of Bleach's core story themes and the foundation of Ichigo's character arc is the idea of exploring the self. In the beginning of the story, Ichigo was the only one who could see spirits. They suffered and died right in front of him, yet he was powerless to help. This sense of helplessness and powerlessness, especially after the death of his mother, became the driving force behind his deep desire to protect others. Thus, he sought power, a power strong enough to cut through fate itself. And in the very first chapter, Rukia gave Ichigo that power. And by chapter 47, Ichigo clearly vocalizes what power truly means to him. His desire to protect is not limited to just his loved ones, it runs deeper than that. For Ichigo, power is a means to fulfill his purpose, and fittingly, that purpose is reflected in his very name, which translates to the one who protects. And as his journey to protect unfolds, the battles he faces are not just about defeating the big bad evil hurting his friends to give him a goal and keep the story moving forward, but rather, almost every one of them was either a reflection of his internal struggles and the ever-evolving understanding of who he is, or an exploration of the core themes that Kubo weaves throughout the story, or most of the time, both of them. In one of the most controversial fights in Bleach, Ichigo's battle against Zaraki, Ichigo was completely outmatched from the very beginning. He hesitated, he cowered, and despite momentarily mustering some courage, he barely even scratched his opponent. And because of his hesitation, Zaraki pierced through his chest, leaving him on the verge of death. Old man Zangetsu then came in rescue and offered Ichigo a choice. Do you want to live or do you want to fight? Ichigo in that moment found his resolve. He didn't want to survive just for the sake of it. He wanted to win. He had to win because if he didn't, his friends would die. So he decided that he would do whatever it took. Old man Zangetsu took Ichigo to his inner world to train him, and the first thing he did was to pair him against White, the part of Ichigo's soul that he had been ignoring. White told Ichigo that knowing his sword's name isn't enough to draw its full power, and that in order to gain more power, he needed to understand his Zanpakuto, which is again a part of himself. According to White, if you open up for your Zanpakuto and lend it your power, if you recognize your Zanpakuto, if you recognize who you are, you will become stronger. This moment encapsulates Ichigo's growth. The key to him growing as a person, gaining more power, or rather acquiring the power he always had, is to resolve his inner turmoil, to recognize every part of himself and accept it. And after Ichigo partially acknowledged his Zanpakuto and proved he was worthy of wielding it, Ichigo's actual true Zanpakuto aided him in battle in order to defeat the, at the time, suppressed Zaraki, resulting to a seemingly unjust victory on the surface if all of this context was missing. And just to be clear, this isn't me reaching in order to make Bleach deeper than it actually is, as this is literally how the power system works. The Zanpakuto spirit is not just the reflection, but also the extension of one's soul. It grants power, not out of obligation, but through recognition. Only when you truly know and accept your Zanpakuto, and by extension yourself, can you access its full strength. This idea is emphasized in the stories of Yumichika and Renji. Both of them called their Zanpakuto by the wrong name, whether deliberately or not, and as a result, their swords only granted them partial power. Their Zanpakutos, in a sense, withheld their true selves until their wielders were ready to understand them. And this was also the case with Ichigo and Zaraki, by the way. Even though Ichigo knew his Zanpakuto's name, he didn't understand its true identity. As for Zaraki, he outright rejected his Zanpakuto as he considered relying on its power a weakness. However, there was a key difference between the two. As early in the story, Ichigo came to the realization that a Zanpakuto is not just a sword, but something more important that has feelings and should be communicated with and acknowledged. That realization marked a turning point for him. From that moment on, he began to grow stronger by gradually tapping into what was already within him in battles until he eventually unlocked his true power by accepting every part of himself in the Thousand-Year Blood War arc. Zaraki, on the other hand, kept suppressing the connection by refusing to hear the voices of his sword, even though after his fight with Ichigo, he openly admitted that he wanted to become stronger. And he did get stronger, but only when he stopped suppressing himself and finally reached out to his Zanpakuto, embracing a part of himself that he had ignored for years. And yes, there were other reasons why Zaraki couldn't access his full potential earlier, but his rejection of his Zanpakuto played a significant role, and it wasn't until he accepted that part of himself that his true strength began to emerge. At first glance, Ichigo's battle against Byakuya seems like a rescue mission. He's fighting to save Rukia. But thematically, it runs much deeper. It's about Ichigo challenging the rigidity of a system he doesn't believe in. Byakuya embodies tradition, law, and emotionless duty. Ichigo, on the other hand, fights not for law or honor, but for connection. He doesn't even want to kill or crush Byakuya over a disagreement. He just wants to stop what he believes is unjust in order to protect a loved one. But unfortunately for Ichigo, at that point in the story, Byakuya was significantly stronger. Despite Ichigo's effort, he would have lost without White's intervention. In the end, Byakuya acknowledged Ichigo as the winner of their fight despite not losing to him. And it wasn't Ichigo's words about how he will rescue Rukia even if it meant fighting the whole Gori 13 that changed Byakuya's heart, but rather his actions. As through White's overwhelming strength he showed after his intervention and Ichigo's refusal to rely on it at the time since he believed that it was external impure power, Ichigo demonstrated his resolve, forcing Byakuya to recognize the weight behind his actions, changing Byakuya for the better. A change clearly seen in the Arrancar saga, after Byakuya defeats the 7th Espada, not because it is his duty as a Soul Reaper, but rather because he's protecting a loved one. Ichigo's resolve transmitted through his transformation told Byakuya what it truly means to fight for something that matters. And Byakuya wasn't the only one changed by Ichigo. In his earlier battle with Zaraki, Ichigo managed to hold his own by drawing strength from his Zanpakuto, forcing a tie with Zaraki which reignited his desire to become stronger, which pushed him eventually to face his past with Unohana and forge a true connection between his Zanpakuto, mirroring the same journey Ichigo had with his Zanpakuto. Ichigo also changed the embodiment of nihilism, Olikyora. As in the battle against him, Ichigo once again demonstrated the reason he fights. He doesn't fight for the thrill or out of duty or because he's capable of winning, but because he has to. Even if he was outmatched or even killed, losing is not an option, which means he will push through his fear, endure despair, and even persist beyond death itself. And in the face of this sheer determination, Olikyora began to change. Seeing Orihime asking for help from Ichigo's corpse and Ichigo taking a strong holoform and beat his ass, Olikyora was able to glimpse Ichigo's plot armor. Olikyora was able to glimpse a truth beyond his own logic, the emotional bonds that give people strength. So in conclusion, the idea that Ichigo conveniently powers up every time he's in trouble is not actually a flaw, it is perfectly in line with his character arc. And again, it would have only been some power of friendship bullshit or cheap plot armor if the powers he gained were not set up beforehand. But they were. Now, I know I haven't actually shown how each of those transformations was foreshadowed or hinted at in this video, and that's because it is literally 3 a.m. and I have 2 exams tomorrow, and I fucking hate myself for choosing to work on this video instead of studying. So just check my other videos linked down in the description for more in-depth explanation. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.